You are made of dead stars, not in a vague, poetic sense, not as a metaphor for the age of the cosmos or the grandeur of the universe. Literally, specifically, physically, the atoms in your body were forged inside stars that lived and died before the sun existed. The carbon in your DNA, the oxygen in every breath you take, the calcium in your bones, the iron carrying oxygen through your blood right now, the nitrogen in your proteins, the phosphorus in the ATP that powers every cellular process that keeps you alive, all of it. Every heavy atom in your body, every atom heavier than hydrogen and helium, was produced inside the nuclear furnace of a star, sometimes many stars, across billions of years of cosmic history, scattered into space by stellar winds and supernova explosions, mixed into the gas cloud that eventually collapsed to form the sun and the planets, incorporated into the early Earth, cycled through rock and ocean and atmosphere, eventually assembled over billions of years of chemistry and biology, into you. You are the universe looking at itself. You are stardust that learned to wonder where it came from. And the story of how we know this, the long, difficult human story of the scientists who figured it out, who were laughed at and dismissed and proven right and proven wrong, and eventually, slowly, assembled the most extraordinary picture of our cosmic origins that the human mind has ever produced, is the story of Fred Hoyle, one of the most brilliant and most infuriating men who ever did science, a man who was more wrong about the origin of the universe than almost anyone in history, and more right about what stars do than almost anyone else, and who made, in the middle of his career, a prediction so audacious and so strange that even he found it uncomfortable. And that turned out to be one of the most important predictions in the history of physics. But to understand why Fred Hoyle's prediction was so remarkable, you have to first understand what the problem was, what the question was that nobody had been able to answer, and why it mattered, and why it was so hard. The question is this: where did the elements come from? Where did carbon come from? Where did oxygen, iron, gold, uranium, calcium, nitrogen, phosphorus, where did all of it come from? This sounds like a simple question. It is not. For most of human history, it was not even considered a question that physics was capable of answering. Elements were just there. They were the given, the starting material, the ingredients that chemistry used to build the world. Where they came from before chemistry got hold of them was not a scientific question but a metaphysical one, or a religious one, or simply a non-question, the kind of thing you accepted without inquiry, the way you accept that the floor is solid and the sky is up. The first person to make the question scientific was not Fred Hoyle. It was a Russian-born physicist named George Gamow, who in the 1940s developed the hot Big Bang theory, the idea that the universe had begun in an extraordinarily hot, dense state and had been expanding and cooling ever since. Gamow and his collaborators, most importantly Ralph Alpher and Robert Herman, worked out the nuclear physics of the early universe and showed that in the first few minutes after the Big Bang, when temperatures were high enough for nuclear fusion to occur, the universe would have produced helium, specifically about 25% of the total mass of the universe in the form of helium-4, with the rest mostly hydrogen. This was Big Bang nucleosynthesis, and the prediction of the hydrogen-to-helium ratio matched observation beautifully. But Gamow had a bigger ambition. He wanted Big Bang nucleosynthesis to explain not just helium but all the elements. He wanted the first few minutes of the universe to be the origin of everything: hydrogen, helium, carbon, oxygen, iron, gold, all of it, forged in the primordial fire of the Big Bang and then dispersed into the expanding universe. This was a clean, unified, appealing idea. The universe began. It was hot. It made all the elements. They spread out. Eventually stars and planets formed from them, and here we are. Elegant, complete, deeply wrong. The problem with Gamow's ambition was nuclear physics, specifically what nuclear physicists call the mass gap at atomic mass 5 and mass 8. When you try to build elements heavier than helium by fusion in the hot Big Bang, you run into an immediate obstruction. You can fuse 2 protons to make helium-2, which is unstable. You can fuse a proton and a neutron to make deuterium. You can fuse further to make helium-3 and helium-4. But helium-4 has atomic mass 4, and the next stable nucleus above it is lithium-6 with mass 6, and to get from mass 4 to mass 6 you have to pass through mass 5, and there is no stable nucleus with atomic mass 5, none. A helium-4 nucleus that absorbs another proton or neutron immediately falls apart. The mass 5 gap is a nuclear physics wall, There is no pathway from helium to the heavier elements through sequential addition of single nucleons, because there is nothing stable to land on at mass 5. And similarly at mass 8, beryllium-8, the nucleus you would get by fusing two helium-4 nuclei, is unstable. It exists for only 100 billionths of a trillion seconds before falling back apart into two helium-4 nuclei. The mass 8 gap is another wall. You cannot build carbon atomic mass 12 by any simple fusion pathway in the conditions of the Big Bang, because you cannot get past the instability barriers at mass 5 and mass 8. Gamow's beautiful unified picture ran directly into these walls and stopped. Big Bang nucleosynthesis makes hydrogen and helium. That is essentially all it can do. Everything heavier had to come from somewhere else. The somewhere else is stars. This was not a new suggestion by the time Hoyle got to it. Astronomers and physicists had speculated for decades that heavy elements might be made inside stars, where temperatures and densities are far higher than in the expanding Big Bang and where nuclei have time, billions of years of time, to undergo complex sequences of reactions that are not available in the few-minute window of the Big Bang. The speculations were reasonable. What was missing was the mechanism, the specific nuclear physics pathways by which stars could actually do the job, could actually bridge the mass 5 and mass 8 gaps and produce the full range of elements we observe. That mechanism is what Fred Hoyle spent the central decades of his career working out, and what he eventually, with 3 collaborators, assembled into one of the most important scientific papers ever published. Fred Hoyle was born in 1915 in a small Yorkshire village in England, the son of a wool merchant, and grew up in a family that was not particularly academic but was unusually interested in the natural world. He showed mathematical ability early and went to Cambridge on scholarship, where he studied physics and mathematics and developed both the sharp quantitative mind that would characterize his best work and the contrarian streak that would characterize his worst. Hoyle did not like authority. He did not like orthodoxy. He had a reflexive skepticism of received wisdom that served him brilliantly when the received wisdom was wrong, which in the questions he was asking it often was, and failed him badly when the received wisdom was right, which it also sometimes was. He was brilliant and he knew it, and his awareness of his own brilliance sometimes shaded into an arrogance that made him difficult to work with and easy to underestimate. During the Second World War, Hoyle worked on radar for the British Admiralty, an experience that, like the wartime scientific service of many physicists, accelerated his practical capabilities and gave him a confidence in applied quantitative reasoning that translated directly into his post-war research. He came back to Cambridge after the war with a set of questions about stellar physics that nobody had answered, and a willingness to attack them with the full force of his mathematical ability. He was going to figure out what stars did. He was going to understand how they worked. Not just in the sense that they fused hydrogen into helium, which had been worked out by Hans Bethe in 1939, but in the deeper sense of what happened to a star over its full lifetime. What processes occurred as it evolved, what it produced and released into space. The first major piece of the puzzle was the recognition that the mass 8 gap, the instability of beryllium-8, was not actually fatal to carbon production in stars. Yes, beryllium-8 is unstable, but unstable in nuclear physics does not mean instantaneous. Beryllium-8 lives for 10 to the negative 16 seconds before decaying. This is an extraordinarily brief time by any human measure, 100 billionths of a trillionth of a second. But in the hot, dense core of a massive star, where helium-4 nuclei are colliding with each other at enormous rates, 10 to the negative 16 seconds is enough time for a third helium-4 nucleus to collide with the beryllium-8 before it decays. The three-body fusion, helium-4 plus helium-4 plus helium-4, passing through beryllium-8 to produce carbon-12, is called the triple alpha process, because helium-4 nuclei are also called alpha particles. Hoyle worked out the rates and the conditions and showed that the triple alpha process could, in the high-temperature, high-density environment of a stellar interior, produce carbon at a significant rate. The mass 8 gap was not a wall after all, it was a very narrow door. Stars could walk through it, but the story did not end there. The triple alpha process was not sufficient. It could produce carbon, yes, but when Hoyle ran the numbers on how much carbon it should produce, something was wrong. The rates were not high enough. The cross-section, the nuclear physics term for the probability of a reaction occurring, was too small. The amount of carbon that the triple alpha process as ordinarily understood should have produced was far less than the amount of carbon actually observed in the universe. Stars should not, by the nuclear physics as it was known, have produced enough carbon to make the universe look the way it does. The numbers were off. And Hoyle sat with this discrepancy and thought about it in the way that the best physicists think about discrepancies, not as a reason to abandon the theory, but as a clue. The clue pointed to a resonance. In nuclear physics, a resonance is an energy state of a nucleus, a specific quantized energy level at which a nuclear reaction can proceed much more efficiently than it otherwise would. Resonances are like resonant frequencies in acoustics. A wine glass vibrates easily at its resonant frequency and is unaffected by other frequencies. A nuclear resonance enormously enhances the probability of a nuclear reaction at a specific energy, allowing reactions that would otherwise be negligibly slow to occur at rates that matter. Hoyle knew this, and he reasoned that the only way the triple alpha process could produce enough carbon to match what was observed was if there was a resonance in carbon-12, a specific energy level in the carbon-12 nucleus, that fell very close to the combined energy of a beryllium-8 nucleus plus a helium-4 nucleus, at stellar temperatures. If such a resonance existed, it would act as a target, a favorable landing spot for the three-body reaction, and enormously enhance the rate of carbon production, solving the discrepancy. This kind of reasoning, this must be true because otherwise we would not exist, is what philosophers now call the anthropic principle. But Hoyle was not making a philosophical argument. He was making a specific, quantitative, testable prediction. He was saying, there must be an excited state of carbon-12 at an energy of approximately 7.65 million electron volts, because if there is not, the triple alpha process cannot produce enough carbon for the universe to look the way it does, and the universe does look the way it does, so the state must exist. He calculated the required energy from the nuclear physics constraints and came up with a specific number. Then he went and found the experimentalists and told them what to look for. The experimentalist he found was William Fowler, at the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, in Pasadena. Fowler was everything Hoyle was not temperamentally: warm, generous, enthusiastic, collaborative, accessible. He was one of the best nuclear experimentalists of his generation, with a laboratory, the Kellogg Radiation Laboratory at Caltech, equipped with particle accelerators capable of probing the energy levels of nuclei with extraordinary precision. Hoyle arrived at Caltech in 1953 and walked into Fowler's lab and told him what he needed measured. Fowler's group were skeptical. There was no theoretical reason within the nuclear physics of the time to expect an energy level in carbon-12 at 7.65 million electron volts. Nuclear theorists who were consulted did not predict such a state. The nuclear shell model, the leading theoretical framework for understanding nuclear energy levels, did not obviously produce such a resonance. Hoyle's prediction was not grounded in nuclear theory. It was grounded in the existence of carbon. We are here, therefore carbon was made, therefore the resonance must exist. It was a chain of reasoning that made experimental physicists deeply uncomfortable, because it was not the way physics was supposed to work. Fowler ran the experiment anyway. He pointed his accelerator at carbon and looked for the energy level. He found it. At 7.6549 million electron volts, essentially exactly where Hoyle had predicted, there was an excited state of carbon-12, an energy level that had never been measured before, a resonance that had been predicted from first principles not by nuclear theory but by the fact of our existence. The measurement was published in 1957. The state is now called the Hoyle state, and it is one of the most famous resonances in all of nuclear physics. Without it, the triple alpha process would produce essentially no carbon. Without it, there would be no carbon in the universe. Without carbon, there is no organic chemistry. Without organic chemistry, there is no life. The Hoyle state is the narrow nuclear door through which everything alive has passed. And Hoyle predicted it from the observation that we are here to make observations. The impact of this prediction on the physics community was significant, though not as immediate as the magnitude of the result deserved. Hoyle was not a man who made it easy for the community to give him credit. He was difficult, he argued loudly, he made enemies, and he had a habit of stating his correct results with the same confidence and stubbornness with which he stated his incorrect ones, which made it hard to distinguish the brilliant predictions from the wrong ones in real time. But the Hoyle state was real, and it had been predicted, and the measurement confirmed it, and that was the kind of result that physics eventually had to deal with on its own terms, regardless of what anyone thought of the man who made it. While the Hoyle state prediction was perhaps the single most dramatic moment in Hoyle's career, it was embedded in a much larger project, The systematic working out of how stars produce all the elements, not just carbon but the entire periodic table. This project was the work of Hoyle's life, and it reached its culmination in a paper published in 1957, one of the most important papers in the history of astrophysics, known universally by the initials of its four authors, B2FH, Burbage, Fowler, and Hoyle. Margaret Burbage and her husband Geoffrey Burbage were both astrophysicists, British-born, both brilliant, Margaret arguably the more talented of the two, and Fowler was the Caltech experimentalist who had measured the Hoyle state. The four of them, working together in a long and intense collaboration in the mid-1950s, assembled the complete theory of stellar nucleosynthesis, a systematic account of how stars produce every element in the periodic table through a set of specific nuclear processes, each operating under specific stellar conditions, each producing a specific range of elements. The B2FH paper, published in Reviews of Modern Physics in 1957 under the title Synthesis of the Elements in Stars, was 104 pages long. It systematically identified 8 distinct nucleosynthetic processes, mechanisms by which stars produce different elements, and showed how these processes, operating in different stellar environments and at different stages of stellar evolution, could account for the observed abundances of every element in the solar system and in the universe. Hydrogen and helium from the Big Bang, everything else from stars. The paper was comprehensive, technically rigorous, and in its broad strokes correct. It is still cited today, not as a historical curiosity but as a foundational document, the basis on which the modern theory of nucleosynthesis is built. The paper laid out a picture of stellar evolution and nucleosynthesis that, in its major features, has been confirmed and refined but not overthrown in the 67 years since it was published. Let us walk through that picture, because it is one of the most extraordinary stories in all of science. The story of how a star lives and dies, and in dying makes the universe. A star begins as a cloud of gas, mostly hydrogen, some helium, traces of heavier elements inherited from previous generations of stars. Gravity pulls the cloud together. As it contracts, the interior heats up, and eventually the temperature and pressure at the center reach the threshold for nuclear fusion, about 10 million degrees Kelvin. Hydrogen nuclei begin fusing to form helium-4 through the proton-proton chain, or the CNO cycle, depending on the star's mass. The energy released by this fusion creates an outward pressure that balances gravity, and the star settles into a stable, long-lived equilibrium, what astronomers call the main sequence, the phase of a star's life where it spends the vast majority of its existence. Our Sun has been on the main sequence for about 4.6 billion years and will remain there for another 5 billion or so. During the main sequence, the star is fusing hydrogen into helium in its core. The hydrogen is slowly depleted. When the hydrogen in the core runs out, the core, now composed primarily of helium, can no longer sustain fusion. Helium requires a much higher temperature than hydrogen to ignite, and it begins to contract under gravity. The contraction heats the core further. Eventually, the temperature reaches about 100 million degrees, and helium fusion, the triple alpha process, ignites. Helium-4 nuclei fuse through the beryllium-8 intermediate into carbon-12. Some of the carbon then captures an additional helium-4 to make oxygen-16. The star is now producing carbon and oxygen, the two most important elements for organic chemistry. The two elements that, after hydrogen and nitrogen, are most abundantly present in living things. At this point, the star has become a red giant. Its outer layers, heated by the shell of hydrogen fusion that continues around the inert helium core, have expanded enormously while the core is contracting and heating. Our Sun will become a red giant in about 5 billion years, swelling to a size that may engulf the inner planets. But the Sun's story, at that point, is near its end. Stars of roughly solar mass do not have the gravity to heat the carbon-oxygen core sufficiently to ignite carbon fusion after the helium is exhausted. They shed their outer layers as beautiful shells of glowing gas, planetary nebulae, and leave behind their hot, dense carbon-oxygen cores as white dwarfs, slowly cooling for billions of years. The carbon and oxygen they produce during helium burning is released into space in the expanding nebula, enriching the interstellar medium for future generations of stars. But for stars significantly more massive than the Sun, stars with 8 or more times the Sun's mass, the story continues into territory that is both more violent and more productive. These massive stars have sufficient gravity to continue heating the core after helium is exhausted, and the additional temperature ignites a sequence of further fusion stages, each more exotic and more rapid than the last. Carbon fusion begins at about 600 million degrees, producing neon, sodium, and magnesium. When the carbon is exhausted, neon burning follows, then oxygen burning at about 2 billion degrees, producing silicon, sulfur, phosphorus, and the elements around them on the periodic table. And then silicon burning, the final fusion stage, occurring at temperatures of about 3 billion degrees, fuses silicon nuclei through a complex series of reactions to produce the iron group elements: iron, cobalt, nickel. The progression is rapid. Carbon burning takes thousands of years, neon burning takes a year, oxygen burning takes months, silicon burning takes days. The star is burning through its fuel faster and faster as it approaches its end. Iron is where the story of stellar nucleosynthesis hits its own wall, as profound in its way as the mass 5 and mass 8 gaps of the Big Bang. Iron, specifically iron 56, the most abundant iron isotope, is the most tightly bound atomic nucleus that exists. Every nucleus lighter than iron releases energy when it fuses with another nucleus. Every nucleus heavier than iron releases energy when it splits apart through fission. Iron is the bottom of the nuclear binding energy curve, the most stable configuration of protons and neutrons. To fuse iron into anything heavier requires adding energy to the system rather than getting energy out. Iron fusion is endothermic. It takes energy rather than giving it. A star that has built up an iron core has exhausted every available source of nuclear energy. The iron core is inert. It cannot burn, it can only accumulate. And as it accumulates, as the silicon burning shell above the core rains iron nuclei down onto it, the core grows heavier and heavier. It is supported against gravity only by electron degeneracy pressure, the quantum mechanical resistance of electrons to being squeezed into the same space, which is a finite resource. When the iron core reaches approximately 1.4 solar masses, a limit discovered by the astrophysicist Subrahmanyan Chandrasekhar and named the Chandrasekhar limit in his honor, electron degeneracy pressure can no longer support it. The core collapses. In a fraction of a second, the core falls inward. In that fraction of a second, electrons and protons are forced together to form neutrons, releasing an enormous burst of neutrinos. The core, now composed of neutrons packed together under almost incomprehensible pressure, suddenly becomes rigid, the neutron star, and the infalling outer layers of the star slam into this rigid core and bounce. The bounce drives a shockwave outward through the star, and the shockwave, assisted by the flood of neutrinos streaming from the core, tears the star apart in one of the most energetic events in the known universe, a core collapse supernova. In those final moments before the collapse, in the silicon burning phase, and especially in the violence of the supernova itself, something extraordinary happens that produces the elements heavier than iron. Because while ordinary fusion cannot make elements heavier than iron, there is another pathway: neutron capture. In the extreme density of the stellar interior, and especially in the seconds of a supernova explosion, free neutrons are produced in enormous quantities, and they slam into nuclei at extraordinary rates. A nucleus that absorbs a neutron becomes a heavier isotope. If it absorbs enough neutrons faster than it can decay by beta decay, faster than it can spit out an electron and convert a neutron to a proton, changing its atomic number, it becomes a neutron-rich nucleus that eventually beta decays to form a stable, heavier element. This is the rapid neutron capture process, the R process, and it is responsible for producing roughly half of all the elements heavier than iron, including many of the most familiar heavy elements: gold, platinum, silver, uranium, thorium, barium, strontium, and dozens more. The R process requires conditions so extreme, so many free neutrons, so rapidly, that for decades after B2FH was published, astronomers debated exactly where it occurs. Supernovae were the obvious candidate, but supernova models have struggled to produce the neutron flux required for the R process in a way that matches the observed abundances of R process elements. And then, in 2017, something happened that settled the question, or at least made a major part of it much clearer. On August 17, 2017, the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, LIGO, detected a gravitational wave signal. Unlike the black hole mergers that had produced the previous gravitational wave detections, this signal had a different character. It was the gravitational wave signature of two neutron stars spiraling into each other and merging. Within 2 seconds of the gravitational wave signal, the Fermi Gamma Ray Space Telescope detected a short gamma-ray burst from the same location. Telescopes around the world, alerted to the detection, swung to the coordinates. And what they found was extraordinary. A kilonova, an explosion roughly 1,000 times brighter than a nova, powered by the radioactive decay of the enormous quantities of heavy elements produced by the R process in the neutron-star merger. Spectroscopic observations of the kilonova detected strontium unambiguously, and the overall brightness and color evolution of the event was consistent with the production of enormous quantities of gold, platinum, and other heavy R process elements. In one event, in one merger of two dead stars, something like 10 Earth masses of gold was forged. The neutron-star merger confirmed what theoretical models had long suggested, that the collision of neutron stars in which the extraordinary neutron densities required for the R process exist naturally, is one of the primary sites of heavy element production. Every gold wedding ring on Earth contains atoms forged in a neutron star collision billions of years ago. The gold existed before the solar system. It fell into the cloud of gas and dust from which the sun and planets formed. It was incorporated into the early Earth. It was eventually extracted by human hands and shaped and polished and placed on a finger as a symbol of enduring connection. The endurance is real, and it goes much deeper than the symbol. The gold has been enduring since before the sun existed. There is also a second neutron capture process, the slow process, the S process, that produces the other roughly half of the elements heavier than iron. The S process operates in the interiors of asymptotic giant branch stars, the late evolutionary stage of stars like our Sun after they leave the main sequence. In these stars, a mix of helium burning and hydrogen burning creates free neutrons at a moderate rate, and nuclei absorb them slowly enough, slowly compared to beta decay, that they build up elements one step at a time, producing a different distribution of heavy elements than the R process. Lead and bismuth, the heaviest stable elements, are primarily S process products. Barium, cerium, and many of the rare earth elements also come largely from the S process. The picture that emerges from all of this is one of extraordinary complexity and extraordinary richness. The universe is not a static collection of elements that has always been as it is. It is a dynamic system of element factories, stars of different masses, in different stages of their lives, producing different elements, releasing them into space at the end of their lives, and enriching the interstellar gas from which the next generation of stars forms. The first stars, the population 3 stars that formed from the primordial hydrogen and helium of the Big Bang, with essentially no heavy elements, were different from the Sun. They were probably much more massive, because the absence of heavy elements changes the cooling properties of gas clouds, and therefore the mass scale at which stars form. They burned fast and died young in supernovae that enriched the infant universe with its first metals. The second generation of stars formed from gas enriched by the first generation. The third generation was richer still. The Sun is a third or fourth generation star, a star whose raw material has been processed through multiple previous cycles of stellar birth and death, each cycle adding to the inventory of heavy elements. The richness of the solar system's chemistry, and the richness of the chemistry available for life, reflects billions of years of stellar processing. This is the context in which Carl Sagan's famous phrase, "We are made of star stuff," finds its full meaning. Sagan said it beautifully. He said it in a way that communicated the wonder of it, but he compressed in those 5 words an entire scientific edifice: the triple alpha process, the Hoyle state, the B2FH paper, the supernova mechanism, the R process, the kilonova, the generations of stellar enrichment, into a phrase that felt like poetry, but was actually nuclear astrophysics. The wonder is in the details. The details are extraordinary. Fred Hoyle, who did more than anyone else to work out those details, is one of the most complicated figures in the history of science, and he deserves to be met in his full complexity, rather than as a background character in the story of nucleosynthesis. Because Hoyle was not just the man who figured out where the atoms in your body came from. He was also the man who gave the Big Bang its name, as an insult, who spent his entire career insisting that the Big Bang had not happened, who proposed instead a rival theory called the steady-state model, in which the universe has no beginning and no end but exists eternally in a stable, unchanging state, with matter continuously created from nothing to fill the space left by the expansion of the universe, maintaining a constant average density forever. The steady-state model was, in Hoyle's version, elegant and philosophically appealing and deeply, completely wrong. The name Big Bang is Hoyle's invention, and it was intended as mockery. In a 1949 BBC radio broadcast, Hoyle was a gifted communicator and a frequent broadcaster, which was not typical for physicists of his generation and which both enhanced his public profile and annoyed his colleagues. He referred to the competing theory of the origin of the universe as the Big Bang Theory, and the name was so vivid and so memorable that it immediately entered common usage. It was not supposed to. Hoyle intended it as a dismissive label for a theory he considered both physically implausible and philosophically unpalatable. He did not like the idea of a universe with a beginning. It felt too much, he said, like introducing a supernatural act of creation into science. A universe that had always existed, that would always exist, that was self-sustaining and eternal. This felt to him more scientific, more honest, less dependent on the kind of cosmic beginning that smacked of religion. He was wrong. The evidence for the Big Bang accumulated steadily throughout the 1950s and 1960s, and the discovery of the cosmic microwave background in 1965, the thermal radiation left over from the hot early universe, exactly as Gamow and his collaborators had predicted, was essentially definitive. The Big Bang happened, the universe had a beginning, the steady-state model was ruled out by observation. Every serious cosmologist in the world accepted this. Hoyle did not. He spent decades developing increasingly elaborate modifications of the steady-state model, trying to accommodate the observational evidence that contradicted it, trying to find alternative explanations for the CMB, never fully conceding. He was wrong, and he was stubborn, and he knew he was stubborn, and he remained wrong and stubborn until the end of his life. This is the paradox of Fred Hoyle, and it is worth sitting with, because it is a genuinely instructive paradox about how science works and how human beings do not. The same man who made one of the greatest predictions in the history of nuclear astrophysics, the Hoyle state, predicted from anthropic reasoning before anyone had measured it, was simultaneously one of the most persistently wrong people in the history of cosmology. The qualities that made him brilliant were intimately connected to the qualities that made him difficult and sometimes wrong. The willingness to follow an argument to its conclusion regardless of what other people thought. The refusal to yield to social pressure, the confidence in his own reasoning. When his reasoning was right, as it was about nucleosynthesis, as it was about the Hoyle state, these qualities led him to discoveries that nobody else made. When his reasoning was wrong, as it was about the steady state, as it was about several other things, these same qualities led him to defend wrong positions with a tenacity that outlasted the evidence against them by decades. He also, later in his career, became associated with ideas that most scientists found frankly embarrassing. In collaboration with Chandra Wickramasinghe, he developed the theory of panspermia, the idea that life did not originate on Earth but arrived from space, possibly from comets carrying biological material. This is not inherently implausible as a general idea. Panspermia is still taken seriously by some astrobiologists as a mechanism for distributing life between planetary systems. But Hoyle and Wickramasinghe pushed it much further, arguing that viruses and bacteria from space were responsible for outbreaks of terrestrial diseases, that the fossil record included fraudulent specimens planted by scientific conspirators, and that the fine-tuning of the universe's physical constants for life was evidence of an intelligence, not a religious god, but some kind of cosmic intelligence that had designed the universe to produce biology. These claims were not well received by the scientific community, to put it mildly. They further damaged a reputation that was already complicated by the steady-state controversy, and they contributed to the fact that Hoyle died in 2001 without receiving the Nobel Prize for nucleosynthesis, a prize that many felt he deserved and that was given to Fowler alone in 1983, with no award to Hoyle, in what some of his supporters have called one of the most unjust omissions in the history of the Nobel Committee. Whether the Nobel omission was unjust is a matter of opinion. What is not a matter of opinion is that Hoyle's scientific contributions were enormous, and that the Nobel Committee's decision not to include him, for reasons that were never publicly stated, left the most important single contributor to the field of stellar nucleosynthesis without the field's highest recognition. Margaret Burbidge, the other co-author of B2FH, also did not receive the Nobel for this work, which is another omission that has drawn criticism, particularly from those who note that women in science have historically been systematically under-recognized by the Nobel committees. Burbidge was, by many accounts, as significant a contributor to the B2FH paper as any of the four authors, and her broader career in observational astronomy. She served as the director of the Royal Greenwich Observatory and was among the first to measure the rotation curves of galaxies. Work that contributed to the evidence for dark matter was of the highest caliber. The story of nucleosynthesis is also intimately the story of the interstellar medium, the gas and dust between the stars, through which the products of stellar nucleosynthesis must travel before they can become part of new stars and planets and eventually living things. Stars do not quietly deposit their products into space, they blow them out. The solar wind, the continuous stream of charged particles that the sun emits in all directions, carries away a slow trickle of the sun's outer layers throughout its lifetime. But the real dispersal happens at death. For low-mass stars like the sun, the death is relatively gentle. The outer layers are ejected in stellar winds as the star ascends the asymptotic giant branch, forming an expanding shell of gas that becomes a planetary nebula, those extraordinary, colorful, symmetrical objects that populate the catalogs of beautiful astronomy images. The Helix Nebula, the Ring Nebula, the Butterfly Nebula. These are all planetary nebulae, the outer layers of dead sun-like stars, enriched with the carbon and oxygen and C-process elements produced during the star's lifetime, glowing as the ultraviolet radiation from the hot white dwarf at their center ionizes the expanding gas. For massive stars, the dispersal is violent and immediate. The supernova explosion rips the star apart in a few seconds, sending the outer layers enriched with carbon, oxygen, silicon, iron, and all the reprocess elements produced in the explosion, expanding outward at thousands of kilometers per second. The supernova remnant expands for hundreds of thousands of years, mixing with the interstellar medium, enriching the surrounding gas with the products of a single stellar lifetime. Some of the most spectacular objects in the sky are supernova remnants, the Crab Nebula, the aftermath of a supernova observed by Chinese and Arab astronomers in 1054 AD, is expanding at over 1,500 kilometers per second and is still producing X-rays and optical emission from the shock-heated gas. The Cassiopeia A remnant, one of the brightest radio sources in the sky, preserves the detailed chemical structure of the star that exploded, different elements distributed in different regions, mapping the layered structure of the progenitor star frozen in the expanding debris. The interstellar medium into which all of this material is dispersed is not inert. It is dynamic. It is continuously stirred by stellar winds, by supernova shockwaves, by the differential rotation of the galaxy, by turbulence on every scale. The heavy elements released by one generation of stars are mixed into the interstellar gas, which eventually becomes the raw material for the next generation of stars. The mixing is not perfect. There are chemical gradients in the galaxy, with higher metallicity closer to the galactic center where star formation has been most intense, and lower metallicity in the outer disk and halo where star formation has been more sparse. The sun's location in the disk, its age, and its metallicity are all consistent with being a third or fourth generation star, a star that formed from gas enriched by multiple previous cycles of stellar birth and death. The time lag between a star's death and the incorporation of its products into the next generation of stars is not negligible. It takes time for supernova ejecta to mix into the interstellar medium. It takes time for the enriched gas to collapse gravitationally into new star-forming regions. The typical timescale for this cycle, from stellar death to the formation of new stars from the enriched material, is on the order of hundreds of millions to billions of years. The solar system formed 4.6 billion years ago from a molecular cloud that had been enriched by previous stellar generations over the preceding 9 billion years of galactic history. The atoms in your body have been through this cycle. They have been part of stars. Some of them may have been part of multiple stars in sequence. A carbon atom that was forged in one star, released into the interstellar medium in a planetary nebula, incorporated into a second star, released again in that star's death, incorporated into the molecular cloud from which the sun formed, and eventually assembled into the molecules in your body. The carbon atom in the DNA in your cells may have an extraordinarily complex history spanning billions of years and multiple stellar lifetimes before it became part of you. This is what it means to say that you are made of dead stars. Not a metaphor, a history. Your atoms have a history that predates the Earth by billions of years, and that history is written in nuclear physics, in the specific reactions, at specific temperatures, in specific stellar environments, that produced each isotope. Isotope ratios in meteorites, the rocky leftovers from the formation of the solar system, preserve a record of the nucleosynthetic history of the material from which the solar system formed, and cosmochemists have spent decades reading that record, identifying the signatures of specific nucleosynthetic processes, and tracing the contributions of specific types of stellar sources to the solar system's composition. It is possible, in principle, to read the biography of the solar system's elements from the chemistry of primitive meteorites, to identify which elements came from core collapse supernovae, which from asymptotic giant branch stars, which from neutron star mergers, and roughly how many stellar generations contributed to the mix. There is a specific meteorite that has played an important role in this kind of analysis: the Allende meteorite, which fell in Mexico in February 1969 and scattered fragments across a large area that were quickly collected and distributed to laboratories around the world. The Allende meteorite is a carbonaceous chondrite, a primitive type of meteorite that formed very early in the history of the solar system and has been little altered since, and it contains pre-solar grains, tiny mineral crystals that formed in the outflows of ancient stars before the solar system existed, that survived the formation of the solar system without being destroyed, and that still carry the isotopic signatures of the specific stars in which they formed. These grains are identified by their anomalous isotope ratios that cannot be explained by the average composition of the solar system but are consistent with the specific nucleosynthetic products of specific types of stars: carbon stars, oxygen-rich giants, type II supernovae. When you look at a pre-solar grain under a microscope, you are looking at a piece of a star that died billions of years before the sun was born. The grain traveled through interstellar space, incorporated into the molecular cloud from which the solar system formed, survived the violence of solar system formation, ended up in a meteorite, fell to Earth, was collected from a field in Mexico, and is now sitting in a laboratory jar at a university somewhere, telling scientists about the star in which it formed. The cosmic is personal in the most literal possible way. The question of life's relationship to stellar nucleosynthesis goes beyond the simple fact that life requires heavy elements that stars produce. It connects to the question of why life requires these specific elements and not others, why carbon specifically is the basis of all known chemistry of life, and whether this reflects a deep physical necessity or a contingent historical accident. The case for carbon as a universal basis for biochemistry is compelling. Carbon forms 4 chemical bonds. It is tetravalent, meaning each carbon atom can bond to 4 other atoms simultaneously, and this allows it to form the extraordinary variety of molecular architectures that biochemistry requires: long chains, branching structures, rings, 3-dimensional frameworks, macromolecules of arbitrary complexity. No other element in the periodic table combines the bonding flexibility of carbon with the stability required for complex chemistry at temperatures where water is liquid. Silicon, which is sometimes proposed as a possible alternative basis for life, forms 4 bonds like carbon but is much less flexible. Silicon dioxide is a solid at ordinary temperatures while carbon dioxide is a gas, which limits the chemistry silicon can support. The case for carbon as the uniquely suitable basis for life is strong, and if carbon is uniquely suitable, then the Hoyle state, the nuclear resonance that makes carbon production in stars possible, is not just a physical necessity but a biological one. The Hoyle state is the reason life can exist. Without it, there is no carbon. Without carbon, there is no biochemistry. Without biochemistry, there is no life. The narrow nuclear door through which carbon is forged is also the door through which all living things have passed. Hoyle himself made this point, and he made it in a way that many found uncomfortable, because he used it to argue for design. Not religious design exactly, but something that felt to him like intelligence, some principle, some bias in the structure of the universe, that made the physical constants and nuclear energy levels come out in a way that permitted life. The Hoyle state is fine-tuned in the sense that its energy must be within a narrow range of the combined energy of beryllium-8 and helium-4 for the triple alpha process to work efficiently. If the Hoyle state were only slightly higher or lower in energy, carbon production would be so inefficient as to make a carbon-based universe impossible. Hoyle argued that this fine-tuning was too precise to be accidental, that it was evidence of something purposive in the structure of physical law. Most physicists and biologists have not followed him into this argument, which crosses from physics into metaphysics in ways that make scientists uncomfortable. The standard response is that in a universe governed by random physical constants, some regions or some universes would have constants that permit life, and we necessarily find ourselves in one of those regions, the anthropic principle again extended to the multiverse. If there are many universes with different physical constants, we should not be surprised to be in one with constants that permit our existence. The apparent fine-tuning is not evidence of design but of selection. We are selected by our existence to observe a universe compatible with it. This argument does not fully satisfy everyone, and the debate about fine-tuning and its implications continues in philosophy and physics. But the physics itself is clear. The Hoyle state exists. It is at the right energy, carbon is produced, life is possible. Hoyle's discomfort with the Big Bang was also connected, in his mind, to these questions about fine-tuning and purpose. He felt that a universe with a beginning, with a moment of creation, was philosophically identical to a universe created by God, and he did not want to do theology when he was trying to do physics. The eternal steady-state universe felt to him more scientifically defensible precisely because it required no beginning, no moment of creation, no first cause. He was wrong about the cosmology. But his instinct that the questions of cosmology and the questions of existence are deeply intertwined, that asking where the universe came from is the same kind of question as asking why the physical constants are what they are, was not wrong. These questions are connected, and the thread connecting them runs through stellar nucleosynthesis, through the Hoyle state, through the triple alpha process, through the iron core of a collapsing star, and the violence of a supernova, and the long journey of atoms through interstellar space from the death of a star to the DNA of a living cell. The modern picture of stellar nucleosynthesis that has grown from the B2FH paper includes details and refinements that the original authors could not have anticipated. The role of neutrinos in supernova explosions, specifically, how the flood of neutrinos from the collapsing core delivers the energy that drives the supernova shockwave, was not understood until the 1980s and was confirmed by the detection of neutrinos from supernova 1987A, the naked-eye supernova in the Large Magellanic Cloud that was observed on February 23, 1987. The detection of 19 neutrinos from SN 1987A in the span of 13 seconds, a tiny number but statistically overwhelming, confirmed the basic picture of core collapse supernova mechanics and opened the era of neutrino astronomy. It also poignantly came with a time lag. The neutrinos arrived at Earth 3 hours before the optical brightening of the supernova because they escaped the stellar core immediately at the speed of light while the optical emission took hours to propagate through the stellar envelope. We saw the neutrinos before we saw the light. We detected the death of the star's core before the news of that death had finished crossing the star itself. The role of neutron-star mergers in our process nucleosynthesis, confirmed by the kilonova of 2017, has refined the picture of heavy element production in ways that are still being worked out. The relative contributions of neutron-star mergers and core collapse supernovae to the R process budget of the galaxy depend on the rates of both events and the yields of R process material from each, and the current data does not unambiguously resolve the relative importance of each channel. Some elements in the R process distribution seem to be better explained by neutron-star mergers, others are more consistent with supernova production. The debate about the precise distribution of R process sites is ongoing and productive. Computer simulations of stellar evolution and supernova explosions have become extraordinarily sophisticated, now running on some of the most powerful supercomputers in the world, and tracking the three-dimensional dynamics of the collapsing stellar interior in detail that was impossible with the tools available to Hoyle and his contemporaries. These simulations are revealing the detailed mechanisms by which supernova explosions propagate, how the neutrino-driven wind from the protoneutron star powers the explosion, how the ejecta is structured, and what its composition is as a function of initial stellar mass and metallicity. The broad strokes of the B2FH picture are confirmed by these simulations. The details are being continuously refined. There is one more dimension of this story that is easy to overlook, but is in some ways the most personally relevant. When you think about the atoms in your body having been made in stars, there is a tendency to think of this as something that happened a long time ago, in a galaxy far away, and that the connection between you and the stars is historical and abstract. But the connection is not finished. You are not the endpoint of the story. The atoms in your body will, after you die, be dispersed, through decomposition, through the cycling of elements through the biosphere and the geosphere and the atmosphere. They will become part of other organisms, part of the atmosphere, part of the ocean, part of the rock cycle. And eventually, over billions of years after the sun has expanded and destroyed the inner planets and the Earth has been incorporated into the expanding red giant or its debris, the atoms that were once in your body will be in space, in the gas cloud around the dying sun, in the interstellar medium. available to be incorporated into the next generation of stars. Some of them will be incorporated. They will be fused again, at much higher temperatures in the nuclear fires of future stars. New elements will be forged from them. Those elements will be dispersed in future supernovae or stellar winds. They will become part of future planetary systems, future oceans, future chemistry, possibly future life. You are not just the product of the stars. You are a stage in the ongoing process of stellar nucleosynthesis, a temporary assembly of atoms that have been through the process before and will go through it again. The atoms in your body have been in stars. They will be in stars again. The universe has been doing this for 13 billion years and will continue doing it for trillions more. You are part of a cycle so vast and so ancient and so continuous that the human concept of beginning and ending barely applies to it. You are a temporary pattern in a flow of atoms that began in the Big Bang and will not end until the last star dies and the last atom decays and the universe reaches its final cold equilibrium. And the fact that you are here, in this moment, aware of this, aware of the nuclear physics that made you, aware of the stellar deaths that scattered your atoms into space, aware of the billions of years of cosmic history that produced the conditions for your existence, is the most extraordinary thing about you. Not your intelligence, not your consciousness, not your capacity for love or art or mathematics. Those are extraordinary too. But the most extraordinary thing is the awareness itself. The fact that the universe has produced from the products of its own stellar furnaces a being capable of understanding the process by which it was produced. The carbon in your neurons forged in a triple alpha process in a red giant that died before the sun existed has become capable of understanding the triple alpha process. The iron in your blood, made in the silicon burning phase of a massive star that exploded in a supernova, has become capable of understanding silicon burning and supernovae. The atoms of a dead star have arranged themselves into a mind that can reconstruct the history of the dead star. Fred Hoyle, who was brilliant and wrong and stubborn and right in approximately equal measure, who gave the Big Bang its name as an insult and spent his career denying it happened, who predicted the Hoyle state from anthropic reasoning and was confirmed by experiment, who wrote the most important paper in the history of nucleosynthesis and was denied the Nobel Prize for it, who made the universe comprehensible to itself in ways that nobody had done before him. Fred Hoyle understood this. He wrote about it, with the rhetorical gift he had that his physics could not always match, with a clarity and a grandeur that the scientists who did not share his unconventional views sometimes tried to deny him. He understood that the question of where the elements came from was not just a question about nuclear physics. It was a question about what we are and where we came from and what the universe is doing. He understood that the answer, that we are made of the ashes of dead stars, that the atoms in our bodies were forged in nuclear fires that burned before the sun existed, that the material of the universe has been cycling through stars and space and chemistry and biology for billions of years and will continue to do so long after we are gone, was one of the most important answers that science had ever produced. He was right about that. Whatever else he was wrong about, he was right about that. And the prediction he made, that a specific energy level must exist in carbon because otherwise we would not exist, is the most beautiful single argument in the history of astrophysics, not because it proved the existence of God or of design or of purpose, but because it proved something even more remarkable, that the existence of a nuclear energy state could be inferred from the existence of the physicist who needed it to exist, that the universe, in making us, made something that could work backward from its own existence to the physics that produced it, that the Hoyle state is real because we are real, and we are real because the Hoyle state is real, and sitting in that circle of inference is everything that science has ever hoped to achieve, the complete, rigorous, quantitative account of where we came from and why we are here. The dead stars made us. We figured out that the dead stars made us, and in figuring it out, we became the universe explaining itself to itself, which may be the most extraordinary thing that has happened in the 13 billion years since the whole process began.